the open meeting law at the TAB Executive Committee. There are a lot, because there's a lot of elected officials on TAB, they are meeting in person, and that will continue until the state statute changes. MnDOT reported more on the Toward Zero deaths. As of August 14th, there were 250 traffic-related deaths, less than the previous year, but still higher than the 5-year average. MPCA reported that the climate action framework was wrapping up, and we'll have a final product in September. For the MAC report, Crimmins reported that the airport is getting ready to do a bond sale of $450 million. This will be used to pay $150 million of old bonds, and the remaining will be used for construction purposes and capital improvements. And for business items, TAB approved a streamlined tip amendment for the Metro Transit bus purchase. They approved the public comment report and recommended approval for the 2023 tip. 2023 to 2026 tip, and they also approved the transportation addendum to the Metropolitan Council's public engagement plan and accepted the public comments. They had 3 information items: the statewide multimodal transportation plan, Minnesota State Highway Investment Plan, and then the regional solicitation outreach tool, which is on the agenda today. And that's what I have.
All right, thank you, Elaine. Appreciate that. Any questions for Elaine? Not seen any. And now I have the window open where I can see if people raise their hands. So if you do have questions, please, by all means, and then I'll see it. So moving on to committee reports, executive committee. We did meet this morning, starting at 8 o'clock. We took the full hour to discuss all the items in front of us today, but we also did look at the meeting look ahead for through the end of the year and discuss what the role of some of the discussion points are for this month and next month, and then ultimately just trying to get a better understanding of what items and when the solicitation recommendations for the funding scenarios and that were taking place. So you will see that coming through in the next couple months. In addition, we did to the items, the action items today, we did talk about maybe a little more discussion on the UPWP and what the role was for TAC and TAC planning with what council has called out as $500,000 that's unprogrammed in planning funds right now. And then we did discuss, as indicated several months ago, the current attendance for meetings and whether we would think it's appropriate to return in person, hybrid, or continue in a virtual format. The executive committee did decide that we should continue in the virtual format, although there probably are times when it's appropriate to meet in person, and that could be at the TAC's discretion for not only TAC, but TAC chair's discretion, but not only TAC, but TAC planning, TAC funding and programming. And I think I'd like to discuss that a little bit more, considering we have the upcoming months and the funding scenarios that will be recommended to TAB, but I'll bring that up in other business at the end of the meeting for general discussion with TAC for that. So I think that kind of summarizes what we discussed during the executive committee today. Are there any questions on that? Not seeing any. We'll go ahead and move forward to our first action item, 2022-34, TAC Bylaws. Joe.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So you might recall that we updated the TAC Bylaws in February, cleaned up a number of inconsistencies. Following that, our Office of General Counsel took a look at the bylaws and has some suggested changes that enable us to be flexible in terms of meeting in person or not meeting in person. So we did talk about this last month. I won't dwell too much on it, but key examples include removing phrases like regular meetings and special meetings and replacing with meetings, or removing while regular attendance is expected, remote attendance will be accommodated in certain circumstances. Removing that sort of enables us to not have whether we meet in person or not set in stone. The biggest change, the only change from last time is there's some language. There was some discussion last month when this was an info item about allowing for TAC alternates to be chairs of standing committees. And so that language acknowledging that possibility is added. And people seem to be for that last time, since this was a topic recently, and might as well clarify that in the bylaws. Also added is that the special committees or the subcommittees, like the transit or the bike ped committee and things like that, that the chair of that can also be an alternate to one of the standing committees, planning or funding and programming, for the same reason. And so Chair Solberg and I talked about that, and thought it made sense to add. So that's what's new. Otherwise, it's what you saw last time. And hopefully this is the second and final time we'll be asking you to update the bylaws.
All right, thank you, Joe. Any questions for Joe on the TAC bylaws? As you heard, he did the summary, but I think one of the big pieces coming out of that is really that TAC members and their alternates can be chair of TAC planning and funding and programming. If there are no questions, I would entertain a motion on that particular item to move forward.
Mr. Chair, this is Joe with Anoka County. I'd make a
Go ahead,
motion
Joe.
to approve.
So moved. All right. So Joe has made a motion to approve TAC bylaws. Is there a second?
Second, Linden.
All right. Thank you, Lyndon. All right, folks, we have a motion and a second to amend the TAC bylaws, and I'll just I'm pulling it up here as we go. Thank you, Joe. All right, so folks, we have motion and a second here to recommend the adoption of the revised TAC bylaws. Is there any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Joe?
McPherson,
Aye.
Robgent,
Aye.
Labrie,
Aye.
Ellos,
Aye.
Isaacson, Freeze,
Aye.
Leitner,
Aye.
Witter,
Aye.
Kotsukos,
Aye.
Peterson,
Aye.
Larson,
Aye.
Harrington or Metro Transit, Solberg,
Aye.
AO,
Aye.
Reef,
Aye.
Fighton,
Aye.
Pittaparthy, Eddie. We were here last time. Eddie, okay. McCullough, Keel, Omi,
Aye.
Kozlucher,
Aye.
Ashfeld,
Aye.
Thompson,
Aye.
Pulver, Hager,
Aye.
Vole, Kurtz,
Aye.
and Dermody.
Joe Brian Isaacson says aye in the chat.
Great.
And Danny McCullough, if his mic didn't come through very well, he says.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
I don't see the chat very well with what I'm doing.
Thank you. Motion passes. So that item 2034 is now in effect. Moving on to the next item, 2022-35, Streamline and Tip Amendment. from Hennepin County for Hennepin Avenue BRT platform removal. Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'll start by saying that each of these TIP amendments, these 5 are the first you'll see for the 2023 through 2026 TIP that TAB recommended approval for last month. The TIP itself is still not actually active and won't be until the USDOT approves it this fall. So what happens here, and we worked this out with FHWA a year or two ago, is that TAB can approve these this month, and then they will wait until USDOT approves before they go to council. So this is approving the TIP that you recently recommended approval on, or amendments to the TIP that you recently recommended approval on. So this happens every year where we get some oddly timed projects. So this first one is the regional solicitation project where bus rapid transit platforms were added via administrative modification to the project in order to sync timing with between BRT platforms and the project applied for. The timing no longer works out, so what is being done in this TIP amendment is removal of the BRT platforms and the costs associated with it, which really just brings the project back to what it always was when it was awarded. So it's kind of an administrative step to undo a previous administrative step. With that, I stand for questions.
All right, thank you, Joe. Any questions for Joe on this particular item? Not seeing any. I would entertain a motion from folks to.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Oh, yep, go ahead, Innocent.
Yes. Joe, the removal of the platform, wouldn't it change what was originally requested? And do you think this would have affected the scores or not?
Mr. Chair and Innocent, no, actually, the BRT was not part of the scored project, so it was added administratively a year or two ago in order to coincide with the timing. But this was never a part of the scoring anyway, because when the project was applied for, the BRT was not a part of it. So we're really just sort of bringing it back to its original form.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Joe or Hennepin County, I suppose, on this particular question amendment? Not seeing any. I would entertain a motion to recommend that the TAB adopt an amendment of the 23-26 TIP to remove the bus rapid transit stations from the description of Hennepin County's bikeway project known as SP 027-652-042.
So moved.
All right, I got a motion. I wasn't quite sure who said it, so.
Hager.
Jennifer Hager.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Jenny.
That's all right.
We have a motion by Jenny, and is there a second?
Innocent.
All right,
Second.
and a second by Innocent. Thank you. All right, folks, we have a motion and a second in front of us to recommend the Transportation Advisory Board recommend adoption of an amendment to the 23-26 Stip to remove bus rapid transit stations from the description of Hennepin County's bikeway projects, otherwise known as SP 027-652-042. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Joe?
McPherson.
Aye.
Robgent.
Aye.
Labrie.
Aye.
Ellos.
Aye.
Isaacson.
Aye.
Freeze.
Aye.
Leitner.
Aye.
Witter.
Aye.
Potsukos.
Aye.
Peterson.
Aye.
Larson.
Aye.
Harrington. Solberg.
Aye.
AO.
Hi.
Reef.
Aye.
Fighton.
Aye.
Eddie.
Aye.
McCullough.
Aye.
I'm gonna skip Omi. Omi.
Aye.
Thompson,
Aye.
Hager,
Aye.
Kurtz,
Aye.
and Dermody.
Aye.
And I did skip people I hadn't heard from. So if you were here and didn't hear your name, let me know.
Yeah, give folks a second on that, but thank you, Joe. That motion passes. 22-35 will move forward to tab in 2 weeks. Moving on to the next item, 2022-36, Streamlined tip amendment for the Vento Trail Extension. Joe.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is a an action involving the this is an error. This should not say removing, adding, sorry about that, adding preliminary engineering for the extension of the Vento Trail. And this is a federal award that was given to Ramsey County to do this. And they're contributing their own local match. And that's really all I have for this one.
All right, thanks, Joe. Any questions for Joe or Ramsey County on this particular item? Otherwise, I'd entertain a motion to recommend the Transportation Advisory Board recommend adoption of an amendment to the 23 to 26 Stip to add preliminary engineering for an extension of the Vento Trail.
So moved, McCullough.
All right, we got a motion by McCullough. Is there a second?
Second by Omi.
All right, thank you, Paul. All right, folks, we have a motion and a second in front of us to recommend that the Transportation Advisory Board recommend adoption of an amendment to the 23 to 26 Stip to add preliminary engineering for an extension of the Vento Trail. Is there any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Joe?
McPherson,
Aye.
Robgent,
Aye.
Labrie,
Aye.
Ellos,
Aye.
Isaacson,
Aye.
Freeze,
Aye.
Leitner,
Aye.
Witter,
Aye.
Kotsukos,
Aye.
Peterson,
Aye.
Larson,
Aye.
Harrington, sorry, he's not, Solberg,
Aye.
Io,
Aye.
Reef,
Aye.
Fighton,
Aye.
Eddie, Omi,
Aye.
no, I missed McCullough,
Aye.
Kozlucher,
Aye.
Ashfeld,
Aye.
Thompson,
Aye.
Culver, no, you're Hager,
Aye.
Kurtz,
Aye.
and Dermody.
Aye.
That is
All
it.
right. Motion passes. Move forward. Item 22-36 will move forward to tab in 2 weeks. Moving on to item number 22-37, Streamline tip amendment for Coon Rapids Boulevard signal system. Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the third of our 5. So this request is simply to add mill and overlay and a turn lane to an intersection signal problem in Coon Rapids. This is an 8-SIP funded project that is having local work added to it. And so this was an administrative modification to the project. And then with the note that no federal funding will be used on these new local items. So this is simply adding local work to a 8-SIP project and acknowledging the mill and overlay and turn lane in the project description and the cost increase, which is entirely local. With that, I would stand for questions.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Any questions for folks on this particular project for Joe or for Anoka County? Not seeing any. I would entertain a motion to recommend the Transportation Advisory Board recommend adoption of an amendment to the 23 to 26 Stip to add the mill and overlay and a turn lane to Anoka County's Casa 1 Coon Rapids Boulevard signal system project, otherwise known as SP 002-601-057.
So move, Ayo.
All right, thank you, Innocent. Is there a second?
Second, Ellis, Hennepin.
All right, thank you, Chad. All right, folks, we have a motion and second in front of us to recommend that the Transportation Advisory Board recommend adoption of an amendment to the 23 to 26 Stip to add a mill and overlay and turn lane to Anoka County's Casa 1 or Coon Rapids Boulevard Signal System Project, otherwise known as SP 002-601-057. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Joe?
McPherson,
Aye.
Robgent,
Aye.
Labrie,
Aye.
Ellos,
Aye.
Isaacson,
Aye.
Freeze,
Aye.
Leitner,
Aye.
Witter,
Aye.
Kotsukos,
Aye.
Peterson,
Aye.
Larson,
Aye.
Solberg,
Aye.
Reef,
Aye.
AO,
Aye.
Fighton,
Aye.
Eddie. Responded once. McCullough,
Aye.
Omi,
Aye.
Lucher,
Aye.
Ashfield,
Aye.
Thompson,
Aye.
Hager,
Aye.
Kurtz,
Aye.
and Dermody.
Aye.
That is it.
All right, thank you. Motion or item number 22-37 is approved, moves forward to tab in 2 weeks. Moving on to the next item, which is 2022-38. Joe.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This is an amendment to increase the total project cost and project length for this Minnesota Highway 36 ramp reconstruction. This is not a regional solicitation funded project. So here's the changes. I think the primary reasoning for extending the length of the project is this retaining wall. We're also naming the ramp bridges as well. So this is a Ramsey County project, and if they wanted to add anything, they could, but otherwise I would stand for questions.
All right, thank you. Any questions for Joe or Ramsey County? Not seeing any right offhand. I would entertain a motion to recommend that the Transportation Advisory Board recommend adoption of an amendment to the 23 to 26 Stip to change the termini, add a retaining wall, and increase the cost of Ramsey County's Highway 36 ramp reconstruction project, otherwise known as SP 6D212-181.
So moved, McPherson.
All right, thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. We have a motion in front of us. Is there a second?
Second.
Believe that was Brian. Folks, we have a motion and a second in front of us to recommend that the Transportation Advisory Board recommend adoption of an amendment to the 23 to 26 Stip to change the termini, add a retaining wall, and increase the cost of Ramsey County's Highway 36 ramp reconstruction project, otherwise known as 6212-181. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Joe?
McPherson,
Aye.
Robgent,
Aye.
Labrie,
Aye.
Ellos,
Aye.
Isaacson,
Aye.
Freeze,
Aye.
Leitner,
Aye.
Witter,
Aye.
Kotsukos,
Aye.
Peterson,
Aye.
Larson,
Aye.
Solberg,
Aye.
AO,
Aye.
Reef,
Aye.
Fighton,
Aye.
Eddie, McCullough,
Aye.
Omi,
Aye.
Lucher,
Aye.
Ashfield,
Aye.
Thompson,
Aye.
Hager,
Aye.
Kurtz,
Aye.
Dermody.
All right. Motion passes. That item will move forward to tab in 2 weeks. Moving on to the next item, 2022-39. Streamlined tip amendment for Southwest Transit Mobility Hubs. Joe.
So this is a tip amendment that adds this project to the 2023 to 26 tip. This project is in the 2022 through 2025 tip, and it's not quite going to be done in time to necessarily be in that tip, so it needs to be added to this tip. So this is a project. This is the Southwest Transit Mobility Hub project, just being sort of carried through from the previous tip to this tip. That I'd stand for questions.
All right, thank you, Joe. Any questions on this amendment in front of folks? Otherwise, I would entertain a motion to recommend Transportation Advisory Board recommend adoption of amendment to the 23 to 26 tip to add Southwest Transit's Mobility Hub, otherwise known as TRS-TCMT-22F.
So move, Ayo.
Thank you.
Second.
Second?
McCullough.
All right, thank you, Danny. All right, folks, we have a motion and a second in front of us to recommend the Transportation Advisory Board recommend adoption of an amendment to the 23 to 26 tip to add Southwest Transit's Transit Mobility Hub, otherwise known as TRS-TCMT-22F. Any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Joe?
McPherson.
Aye.
Robgent.
Aye.
Labrie.
Aye.
Ellos.
Aye.
Isaacson.
Aye.
Freeze.
Aye.
Leitner. Witter.
Aye. Sorry, delayed aye.
Witter.
Aye.
Kotsukos.
Aye.
Peterson.
Aye.
Larson. Aye. Harrington. Oh wait, yes. Solberg.
Aye.
AO.
Aye.
Reef.
Aye.
Fighton.
Aye.
Eddie.
Aye.
McCullough.
Aye.
Omi.
Aye.
Resolucher.
Aye.
Ashfeld.
Aye.
Thompson.
Aye.
Dager.
Aye.
Kurtz.
Aye.
And Dermody.
Aye.
That is it.
All right, thanks. Motion passes. That item 22-39 will move forward to tab in 2 weeks. Moving on to item number 2, Planning Commission TPP Working Group report out. Scott, do you want to introduce this?
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair. So the TPP Technical Working Group continues to meet on various items related to updating the 2040 TPP to the year 2050. At the August meeting of the work group, members heard 3 information presentations on the Minnesota State Highway Investment Plan and Engagement, the e-commerce freight distribution study that's being commissioned by council staff, and an overview of existing policies in the 2040 TPP. Members also participated in a Mentimeter activity to identify other areas of existing policy not captured in the 2040 TPP, and this item will return to the working group in October for summary and gaps discussion. Tomorrow at the working group, at the September meeting, we will hear presentations on the TPP goals, review, engagement, and update study. Also, there'll be a presentation on the Regional Transportation and Climate Change Multimodal Measures Study, and there'll also be presentations on travel behavior inventory and transportation system performance evaluation and results. At TAC planning, there is an action item before you today that was considered at our August 11th meeting, and that is action item 2022-31. TAC planning is recommending that TAC adopt the 2023 Unified Planning Work Program. And what this program does, it sets the work activities for MPO staff and the various consultant studies that we will engage in over the year that further our vision for the TPP and the regional solicitation and other planning activities. There was one outstanding item for your consideration that was not acted on by TAC planning. There is $477,000 roughly available of additional IIJA federal funding that's available for programming in the 2023 UPWP. We didn't take a specific action on recommending anything on that at TAC planning, but that is something that TAC can consider if they would like.
All right. Thank you, Scott, for that. Is there Joe or Steve? Dave? I guess it's Dave. Dave, did you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I actually have a brief presentation here about the UPWP, so we all have a good understanding of what it is and what we're trying to accomplish. Everyone can hear me okay, right? I've been having mic issues this week. Okay,
Dave,
great, thank you.
I just want to make sure, is your PowerPoint showing? I can't really see what I'm sharing here.
It is. You can maximize it actually, Joe. Maximize, whatever, and put it in. There you go. Thank you very much. All right, Dave Burns, glad to be here. Next slide, please, Joe. So I'm just going to cover briefly kind of an overview of the UPWP, some of the content within the UPWP, and then I'll just briefly cover a couple of the key planning studies that are continuing on from this year into 2023, and then a couple of 2020, or a couple of studies that are meant to kick off in 2023 that might be of particular relevance and interest to the committee. And then I'll talk briefly about that draft UPWP budget and then the excess funds. Wouldn't call it an issue, but we can have that discussion. Next slide, please, Joe. All right, so the UPWP is required by federal laws for all MPOs within the country. And our UPWP stems from really the goals and objectives outlined in our 2040 TPP. It also, in addition, addresses some of the pressing issues and concerns expressed by our local planning partners over the course of not just this year, but multiple years. The UPWP really serves to outline and detail the work activities that staff will perform in 2023. So this includes our transportation planning activities, our studies, which are often performed in coordination with consultants, and a fairly detailed budget for each of these items. And really, this is actually an application that we must submit in order to receive federal transportation planning funds. So it's required by FHW and FTA in order to receive these federal planning funds, which represent really the majority of the funding. And once it is approved, we submit it to MnDOT and FHWA for review and approval. Next slide, please, Joe. Great. So we basically have the UPWP structured, so it's organized into 6 major categories as shown on the left. So each category, and you're going to see this on the budget page when we get to it, includes a calculation of the total staff time and the cost of that staff time, the consultant time and costs, the estimated expenditures, and the total cost for projects within that category. So just in general, some tasks are part of the planning process and ongoing and repeated year after year. One example is like the staff time that it takes to prepare for our TAC committee here and staff it. And others change based upon the regional needs and priorities as outlined in the TPP. And you can see that really pretty concretely in the consultant studies. So of note here, in 2023, our total consulting budget exceeds $2 million, which, as far as I know, even probably adjusted for inflation, might be a new record. It's we have a lot of funds and a lot of time dedicated to project management and consultant studies. Just an example, as you read through the document, on that right-hand side, you'll see like activity A total, got the total staff weeks, associated costs, and then new studies beginning in 2023, and studies continuing from 2022, or in rare cases 2021, that have a 2023 budget component. Great. Next slide, please, Joe. Okay, as you can see, we have a lot of studies that we're working on right now and or are in the process of beginning. So these are the studies that will be continuing on from 2022. So two I'm going to outline are, well, the first is the TPP Goals Review, Engagement, and Update Study. I just want to outline this one a little bit because it's going to assist and helping for the upcoming TPP update in 2024, which will bring the horizon year to 2050. It's going to help assess progress of the transportation vision, goals, and objectives, and really kind of facilitate a regional discussion on revising these goals and objectives from the current TPP and ensure that they're still consistent with what we want as a region. It's also going to reassess the approach to the congestion mitigation and overall mobility, given really the changing travel behaviors we've seen over the past few years since our last TPP updates. The other is this Regional Transportation and Climate Change Multimodal Measure Study. This will really help provide a more detailed approach on evaluating the emission benefits and the impacts on our overall plans, programs, and even individual projects. It will help to better weigh emissions trade-offs, trade-off of investments and planning decisions, and result both as a guide for how to better calculate project emissions within the region and really kind of help identify projects with the greatest positive benefit and those with the greatest negative benefits. So with the TP, I know both of these are in the procurement phase and should be under contract within the next month or so. Next slide, please, Joe. So as you saw previously, we have a lot going on, kind of just beginning here for 2022 on some of those studies. But we do have an additional 4 consultant projects here, planning studies for 2023. One is the Regional Solicitation Evaluation, always a popular topic. The purpose of this is of the study is to tie in project selection more closely with the Regional Development Guide, or Thrive 2.0, if you will, and the 2050 Transportation Policy Plan, both of which are currently being updated and will be ready by the end of 2024. So this helps ensure that the region's current transportation goals and objectives are being incorporated into the project selection in the regional solicitation. So it's more of a direct, concrete connection with what we have in the TPP priorities and the vision listed there, and what we're actually funding through the regional solicitation. Some of the tasks include an assessment of the outcomes of projects selected within the past decade, and an evaluation of the entire regional solicitation program process, including project application categories, our selection criteria, and really the measures for selecting projects. So that's a pretty big budget item that is kind of a hard look and potential revamp of the regional solicitation process. And we do that approximately once every 10 years. So the other one is the Metropolitan Highway System Harms, Impacts, and Mitigation Priorities Study. Really, the purpose of this one is to explore how freeways or highways in general have had a significant burden on communities and persons in the path of and living nearby these highways, particularly emphasizing those especially impacted, including Black, Indigenous, and other populations of color, low income, and low wealth populations. So this study will actually identify long-term and continuing harms and impacts of the highway system on these adjacent communities and propose mitigation investments and funding for eventual inclusion in the regional plan. Some of the tasks here are to identify communities near the highway system that have and continue to be most harmed and impacted by the highway system, develop criteria and measures for quantifying these harms and impacts, and identify investments that could mitigate the past and continuing harms and impacts to the affected communities. Next slide, please, Joe. So here we have the draft UPWP budget. It's pretty large this year, and that's mainly due to two reasons. We did get an increase due to the IIJA federal funding bill, so that resulted in additional planning funds available to not just our MPO, but all MPOs. And our overhead rate, which is kind of calculated annually and fluctuates pretty significantly annually. Last year, it was somewhere around the 85% range. I can never quite remember that exact number. This year, it went down to 34%. So we have a lot more money to spend on consulting costs and potentially salary for existing and new employees. Basically the result is just more funds available for salary and consultant studies than we really had anticipated last year. And this budget does assume new positions. Go to the next slide, please, Joe. Thank you. Okay, so as we kind of discussed briefly earlier, we currently have available federal funds that total 5.5 million, which would hypothetically allow for a total budget of 6.864 million. We have only budgeted at this point about 6.386 million. So we have in a total of $477,511 remaining to allocate. Now, this does include both the federal and the match funds at an 80-20 rate. So the federal funds are around somewhere around 380, and the local match is 100,000, somewhere around there. We have had conversations with MnDOT and FHWA, and they have approved us to essentially save these funds for 2024. So most cases, it's a use it or lose it situation when it comes to these federal planning funds, but there's more flexibility with the FTA allocation of the planning funds. And we can actually bank the FTA funds and use them the year in 2024, 1 year later. We could also kind of bank those funds for now, and if additional activities or ideas come up over the course of 2023, we will have that $477,000 available, and we can do an amendment to either prior to 2023 adoption of this or an amendment to the at a later date during the actual year of 2023 to add additional tasks or work items. So that's something that I think if you guys wanted to have a discussion, that'd be more than welcome. That is it for the presentation. Joe, if you just want to go to that last slide. Any questions? I am more than happy to help answer.
All right. Thank you, David. Appreciate the overview, UPWP, and some of the highlights of some of the things you're doing in there. And I do see we already have some questions popping in. So, Lissa, why don't you go ahead?
Thanks, Steve. Can you go back to the slide? Sorry, I know you just stopped sharing your screen, but can you go back to the slide that has the list of all the projects?
Yeah, Joe was sharing it, so you can. Thank you, Joe.
Is it just me, or I'm seeing just a gray screen?
It's still gray, yeah.
Yeah, it's still gray.
Well, my question, I was trying to get the wording right. My question is about the item about the regional solicitation.
Mm-hmm.
And just wondering what the process is to bring that scope. I mean, obviously we're just, approving titles, if you will, but what is the process for getting input on that scope once that process kicks off?
That's a great question. And I don't want to speak too much for the project manager of.
Yeah, Dave, let me jump in here.
Okay.
Yeah. That's Alyssa, this good question. We've allocated an estimated budget of 500,000 to 600,000 for that item, which for the regional solicitation evaluation, which will stretch. It'll start in 2023 actually, and potentially could stretch into 24, 25, and even a tiny bit into 2026 here. So it's a big study for us monetarily and kind of the duration of it too. It's one of our bigger studies. So I imagine that we'll have plenty of engagement as to what those tasks would be, and we do have a healthy budget for it. So, look forward to, especially in early 2023 here, we'll kick that off, and I think over several meetings with our partners, kind of fine tune what people want to see. The biggest goal of it is to bring in the new Thrive MSP 2040 or whatever we call it, and the new TPP into our funding decisions. That's the primary purpose. We did it 10 years ago, and so now we'll be doing it again.
So the answer is yes, that will come to this group and tab for input.
Is that all you wanted? Yeah.
I mean,
yes.
That's what I want to make sure that this group as well as tab has input in this. And where I'm kind of going is that I know there's been a lot of questions about the item later in the agenda for the public input survey, and a lot of comments back to your staff about making sure that there's not just kind of a one-off engagement, that how the TPP should drive that. Is there a way to look at performance measures as opposed to just setting midpoints? I mean, so to me, that's kind of linking a lot of where I know your staff has been getting comments then to this planning study. So good to hear that there's a healthy budget for this, but just want to make sure that, 6 months from now, when we're soliciting input on what the scope should be, we don't all forget the comments we made to you in the last 2 months about that.
Yeah. Perfect. Yes. The answer is yes. We'll bring it to this group and many others.
Okay. Anything else, Lissa?
Nope.
Okay. Lyndon.
Oh, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, if we could go back to that list. There we go. Can you give me a little more info, Dave, on the regional safety action plan and how that relates to county safety plans, MnDOT safety plans, etc.?
Yeah, thank you, Lyndon, and thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, Steve, since you're on there and you're the project manager of that regional safety plan, if you would like to handle Lyndon's question.
Yeah, thanks, Lyndon, and committee members. The regional safety action plan, we're in the procurement process right now, selecting the consultant. But one of the goals of it is to have a compliant US DOT plan for the Safe Streets and Roads for All program, and that's one of the objectives. Is by next summer to have met all the list of requirements to have a compliant plan, at which time our partners will be able to apply for actual implementation grants or capital projects based on that plan. You probably know that it's a two-step process here. First, you have to have the planning done, and then you can apply for projects. And various partners are at different stages of that process, whether they can apply for a capital. Most cannot apply for a implementation grant. So long story short, that's one of the objectives. How does it interact with county road safety plans? You can mix and match various planning efforts to meet that US DOT Safe Streets and Roads for All requirements. And so I'd imagine that counties such as yourself could do that. The county road safety plans are much more specific as to locations and potential solutions to those crash issues. This will be a higher level regional plan, so it won't get into that same level of detail.
Okay, I know as part of that Safe Streets for All, we actually did our own plan because we have our county road safety plan is still in progress. So we created an amendment to our old one to do that. I know part of the requirements are you have to prioritize your investments, right? Short, mid, long term or whatever. So the region won't do that. They'll just look at more categorical investments rather than specifics region-wide.
Yeah, Mr. Chair and Lyndon, that is correct. This won't be specific investments at specific locations. We don't have the time or probably budget to do that. And that's really more for the county road safety plans and some other city efforts that maybe have gone to that level of detail.
So is it required for the MPO to do this?
The answer is no.
Okay.
MPOs do not have to do this. What we've heard from several of our partners is they would find value in doing it, especially at the city level, because cities don't have the county road safety plan. So to get the planning work done at a regional scale would at least open up the opportunity for funding for counties too, but city partners would be kind of maybe left behind without that planning work.
All right. My second question, Dave, is on the next slide. Or has the group considered, one thing I'm worried about, of course, as everybody else is the effect of climate change. Did we look at resiliency, some sort of climate change resiliency plan? I know there's several counties and cities, of course, that are concerned about their infrastructure and how and more intense rainfall, et cetera, will affect their infrastructure. I don't see that as something on the list anywhere.
Dave, you want me to keep going on this?
Yeah, go for it, Steve.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mr. Chair and Lynn. So the council right now is doing an internal focused plan for climate change. And I think what we're trying to discuss right now is if the council, as a next step, does an external plan, or if we do one just for transportation. Either way, there will be a future planning effort that will get at some of these resiliency questions.
It seems to me that would be an important category, next solicitation is some of those projects that may be able to be fixed that won't score well with the current scoring methodology, but are important, and they're kind of in a tough spot right now.
Sure, good. Thanks for the feedback.
Anything else, Lyndon?
That's it. Other than the 477,000, I don't know if this is the time to discuss ideas on that. Or you gonna do that?
Maybe I think you even brought up some now, but how about can you hold and I'll go to Scott and Innocent and then Chad. Go ahead, Scott. There, Scott.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute there. Okay. Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think as most of you know, as part of the reauthorization bills, probably for the last 2-3 cycles, there's been sort of a movement by US DOT and Congress to evolve to more of a data-driven, performance-based investment approach. That's reflected in the reauthorization bill and it's trickling down to the USDO, to the state DOTs and to the MPOs. And our MPO is working on that. We do have performance measures, but it's my understanding that most of those measures are tied to the MnDOT system and not to the A minor arterial system where we invest most of our regional solicitation dollars. So I've had a discussion with staff about that, and if there would be a benefit of moving in a direction to have more of a data-driven investment approach tied to the A minor system that we invest in. We sort of kind of fall back now on the modal ranges, I believe, roadway, transit, bike ped that are sort of tied to, I believe, historic investments. And, there's conversations about where we should fit in those modal ranges, but the modal ranges themselves, there really isn't much influence about the performance or the condition of the system. It's more just tied to the ranges themselves and people's or agencies' opinions about where we should fall in those ranges based upon the experiences or issues that they have within their agencies. And so I guess where I'm going with all of this is in talking to staff, if we want to move in a more performance-based, data-driven direction for the A minor system that we principally invest in, we would have to collect some performance data for that A minor system that we largely do not have right now. So travel time, bridge condition, pavement condition, crash rates. I think we have a lot of that information readily available from our partner agencies and from MnDOT and other sources, but we don't have it collectively housed within our MPO, and we're not utilizing it as part of our planning process. So just throwing that out there as a possible work activity that could be incorporated into existing studies or some kind of future study as part of the UPWP. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. It seems that there may be some connection between that and part what Lyndon was talking about with resiliency, understanding that. Steve, did you want to respond to that or?
Yeah, and just hearing Scott again mention that and just describing our regional solicitation evaluation coming up here, that might be a decent task to bring into that discussion, whether either amending that budget to be bigger if needed or just as one of the tasks within that 500,000 seems to make some sense. And we can send out, the other Lyndon's point was about the climate resiliency. Our community development department has done some work on that, and maybe we can send a link out on some of the flooding work that they've done. That might be interesting to folks.
All right. Thank you for that, Steve. Community development, you said, has done that?
Yeah, they have, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it might be interesting to see what they've done and maybe how that relates to our agencies and the work they're doing. So, all right, we'll go to Innocent.
Council, Mr. Chair. David, I'm referring to the stories for 2023, the one involving EV parking station or parking need analysis. Is this just specifically to study the need for EV in the region, or are you coordinating or leading with the projects that Amended or PCA are already doing, or using VW money?
Yeah, great question, Innocent. And Steve, jump in here if I'm wrong, but I'll start this off by saying I believe this is kind of a needs analysis of where I don't want to say deficiencies, but where we might need electric charging stations to much better equip the region for a significant influx in EV adoption. So it's kind of identifying locations that are most crucial for EV charging locations.
Okay. All right. The PCA one is kind of more of statewide. So yes, we consider on a mostly regional basis. Okay.
Yeah, and that gets a little tricky. I mean, since we are the MPO, these funds have to be used for planning kind of specific to the MPO region. So you could maybe tie in some statewide funding with kind of this CPG MPO funding. But yeah, we can't use the actual, $477,000 on a statewide analysis.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Innocent. Chad, you're back up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just a comment here, and just want to applaud Steve's leadership in foresight in developing the regional safety plan to make our agencies, metro agencies, eligible to bring in additional safety funds to the region. So great job stepping up to advance TZD and Vision Zero.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Chad. Moving on, let's see. I think we're back to Lyndon.
Oh, just a quick follow-up to Scott's point about the performance measures on the A minor system. I think that's a great idea. If we remember, was it 10 years ago or so, we did an A minor arterial study, and I think it was really well done. So I would suggest that maybe gets looked at, refreshed.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, that's thank you, Lyndon. That's a great point. And that study, who I think was performed on the consultant side by Mr. Peterson over there, has come up recently in our functional classification study. So appreciate it, and I would, personally, I think the idea of tying performance-based planning and programming more concretely into our regional solicitation is a very solid one.
Okay. David, let's see. I think Scott, you have your hand up.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I just didn't put my hand down from earlier.
Oh, okay. All right, maybe one more, David. Here as I was looking at the TPP goals review, engagement, and update. Just wondering a little bit more. You described, since we've had these various comments that have come in here, how would any of those, I mean, even as we talk about A minor arterial study or the resiliency, how might those pieces, how are they fitting into this TPP goals review? I'm not quite sure what that, what the scope of that review is. Is that really just setting up for the TPP, or is that something different?
It's a great question. Cole, did you want to take a crack at that, since you're the project manager and certainly know more about that than
Sure.
I do?
That project is actually going to be an info item at the TPP Technical Working Group Thursday. The primary purpose of that is to do regional assessment of our goals and objectives in the 2040 TPP with a look towards 2050, kind of identifying areas that maybe we need to expand upon or be more focused around. And so it's mostly going to be actually listening sessions with various partners from around the region. So it's more of an engagement project than it is an actual study. And as I said, if folks want to learn more, the TPP Technical Working Group presentation will be this Thursday.
All right, thank you, Cole. Appreciate that. I guess just trying to rectify some of the assessment of the 2040 TPP goals, looking at the 2050 and some of the discussion we've had here today. But maybe some of that is a little more focused ultimately on the solicitation and how the TPP guides the solicitation. So maybe that'll come up in discussion, I'm sure, during your engagement. All right, anybody else with questions? Oh, looks like Carl has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question about EV charging stations. I know that we struggle oftentimes trying to figure out how we encourage the adoption of EVs in our city, and we naturally move towards EV charging stations and kind of public infrastructure for that because it's kind of in our control. But I sometimes wonder if that's actually the critical path towards better adoption of EVs. And I don't know if people know, has there been a study that kind of assesses what's actually the best way to increase adoption? I sometimes wonder if EV charging stations isn't the thing.
Actually, a great question, Carl. And one thing I neglected to mention is that this EV public charging needs analysis will also focus on the development of a framework for the policies for where we place public chargers. So part of that is going to be kind of working with cities to sort of help increase adoption of that, if that makes sense.
All right, Carl, anything else on that one?
No, thank you.
Okay, all right. All right, anybody else with questions on the UPWP for David? Dave, appreciate the work into this and answering the questions that have come up. Sounds like we have some folks have some general thoughts. I see some comments in the chat as well, supporting, I guess, Lyndon and Scott's comments, and I think those were really about the A minor system and developing the data on that. I would think that any discussion on this should also go back to TAC planning to help vet out what some of those needs might be here in the future as well. And understanding that, as you phrased it, the UPWP can move forward. It isn't unusual to add or to amend the UPWP throughout the year. So it sounds like that's certainly a real possibility, not to mention that you guys have already done the homework with the FHWA, MnDOT, FTA about being able to carry over the funds. So it sounds like you have a couple different directions you can move depending upon priorities that come about through the process. So with that, again, any other questions for staff?
A final comment, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Lyndon.
I applaud you guys. It's an enormous amount of work and it's going to be a heavy lift. So we're here to help you. So I'm assuming you'll be asking for volunteers for these various studies.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So there you go. You get ready-made volunteers already, Dave.
All right, great. Thank you, Lyndon, for the comment.
All right. With that, unless there's another comment, I would entertain a motion that recommend the TAB recommend adoption of the 2023 Unified Planning Work Program.
Mr. Chair will move Innocent here.
All right. Thank you, Innocent, for the motion. Is there a second?
Second, Merrick.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. All right, folks. We have a motion and a second in front of us to recommend the TAB recommend adoption of the 2023 Unified Planning Work Program. Any further discussion? Not seeing any or hearing any. All those in favor say aye by a roll call. Joe?
McPherson.
Aye.
Robgent.
Aye.
Labrie.
Aye.
Ellos.
Aye.
Isaacson. He might have left. Freeze.
I am voting for Isaacson. Merrick, aye.
Freeze.
Aye.
Leitner.
Aye.
Witter.
Aye.
Kotsukos.
Aye.
Peterson.
Aye.
Larson. Aye. Solberg,
Aye.
AO,
Hi.
Reef, I believe left. Fighton,
Aye.
Eddie,
Aye.
McCullough,
Aye.
Keel,
Aye.
Omi,
Aye.
Lucher,
Aye.
Ashfeld,
Aye.
Thompson,
Aye.
Hager,
Aye.
Kurtz,
Aye.
and Dermody.
All right. Motion passes. I'll move on to tab in 2 weeks. Moving forward to our next item, which is item number 22-32, HSIP program year extension I-35W continuous lighting. I don't know, Michael, do you want to introduce this or are you okay with Joe?
Quickly introduce this. Yeah, as you mentioned, this is a MnDOT project for a program year extension from 2024 to 25 along I-35W in Burnsville for continuous lighting. So I believe this was passed unanimously. There wasn't a whole lot of discussion on this, but I'll turn it over to Joe if you want to add anything additional.
Joe? Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, chairs. Yeah, this is really for the purpose of moving this MnDOT project back 1 year in order to align with another project. Otherwise, the project would probably be done and then undone in order to do the next project. So it's really an efficiency and stewardship action.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Any questions from members on this particular project? Otherwise, I would entertain a motion to recommend the tab approve MnDOT's I-35W continuous street lighting project, otherwise known as SP 1981-147 from fiscal year 2024 to fiscal year 2025.
So moved, McPherson.
All right, we have a motion by Joe McPherson. Is there a second?
Second by Keel.
All right, and a second by Carl. Appreciate that. All right, folks, we have a motion and a second in front of us to recommend tab approve MnDOT's I-35W continuous street lighting project, otherwise known as SP 1981-147 from fiscal year 2024 to fiscal year 2025. Is there any further discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye by roll call. Joe?
At this point, I should be able to do this without consulting my list. McPherson.
Aye.
Robgent.
Aye.
Labrie.
Aye.
Ellos.
Aye.
Isaacson.
Merrick for Isaacson, yes.
Thanks, Scott.
Aye.
Sorry. Freeze.
Aye.
Leitner. Witter.
Aye.
Kotsukos.
Aye.
Peterson.
Aye.
Larson. Aye. Solberg.
Aye.
AO. AO. Reef left. Fighton.
Aye.
Eddie.
Aye.
McCullough.
Aye.
Keel.
Aye.
Omi.
Aye.
Lucher.
Aye.
Ashfeld.
Aye.
Thompson.
Aye.
Was that an aye? Hager.
Aye.
Kurtz.
Aye.
And Dermody.
All right. Motion passes. That will move forward to tab in 2 weeks. Moving on to our next item, information item, and it looks like Bethany is going to give us an overview of the Regional Solicitation Public Input Tool results.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am going to keep this very, very brief so we can get on to the main event. As Joe's pulling it up, we did get 560 responses, which is pretty good for this little survey. Most of them came from Hennepin County, as we would expect. We also did have some pretty great suburban turnout. Because of the differences of the representation in each of the counties, Joe, I'm on slide 2 if you want to catch up. We did weight those so they are proportional to their county's population, which helps balance those Hennepin responses with some of the other counties' responses. If you want to skip to slide 4, Joe, I think next one, please. So here we have on the left side of each of these charts is what the midpoint of the regional solicitation funding is. And then the general public, which does include folks who are technical staff from agencies, but not involved in any of the committees or the Transportation Advisory Board. And so you can see within the roadway category, both the general public and those within the process spent a little bit less on their roadway projects than the midpoint. Transit is very, very close to that midpoint, and the bicycle and pedestrian is a little bit more than the midpoint. And for both those in the process and the general public, they did spend more than the upper range of that midpoint. And I think a key point within this is that it does not include any of kind of the pavement preservation work. This is expansion. And so the survey did not ask how you would balance these new types of projects with system preservation. And so within the PowerPoint, there are a lot more data slices and dices by county and drive land uses. But I am going to skip those for today so that we can get to the key takeaways and then those funding scenarios. So Joe, if you want to jump to the very last slide.
I don't know a better way to do it. Ah, crap.
So ultimately, the demand for roadway spending depends on the county and your land use. So rural areas, suburban areas that are seeing a lot of growth are seeing respondents from those areas are requesting much higher levels of funding, roadway funding, than those urban areas. Carver and Scott County, as fast-growing counties, are seeing the most need for additional capacity. So they were spending significantly more on that project category. So our transit spending overall is right in the sweet spot between that modal range. And again, urban areas and interestingly, Anoka County spent the most in those transit funding ranges. And then Scott, Carver, Washington, and Dakota spent a little bit less than the bottom of the modal funding range. And regardless of your land use, and most of the counties, they spent above the top of the modal range for bicycle and pedestrian facilities, including whether they were in the process or not. So with that, I know it was very brief, but are there any questions on the survey results?
Bethany, just a quick question on what you said there at the last. The bicycle and pedestrian in that survey was above the modal range or above the midpoint?
Above the modal range. So the modal range was 10 to 20%. And so we did see both those in the process and the general public spending 22 to 25% of their budget.
All right. Thank you. And, you know, I think we talked a little bit about this at the executive meeting for folks and really kind of the discussion about that this is a small sample size across the metro. I think, what was there, like 15 or 18, depending upon the county, but also hindered a little bit by the fact that folks had already seen the potential projects out there and those within the system and maybe some of those outside the system. Maybe already have a general idea of what could be funded. So that could potentially do this. Again, Bethany's heard this probably 3 or 4 times, I think already. So nothing new to her, but wanted to make sure folks understood that I think there are some improvements and I think that could be done for the next iteration of this outside of any changes in the way that were described maybe earlier in more of a performance-based analysis that was discussed during the UPWP discussion earlier tonight or earlier this morning. So with that, I think I'll just leave it and go to Joe, who has a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the presentation and the feedback on the study. I think you brought up a lot of the points I was going to mention. I think this could be a very useful tool, maybe used at a different time, maybe during when we look at the TPP and we're updating the planning documents and how we want to move forward. I think it'd be a really interesting tool to use there. The other thing I just wanted to note too and ask is, are we expecting TAB members to use the data from this for discussions with funding lines and that type of thing? Because this data coming out now, that's the next step. Is that something that's being considered, or do they look at this as just simply, this is just some quick results? It was a quick study, very small sample size. Where does this sit at?
Yeah, so I wasn't here for the last cycle, but it's my understanding that TAB did request more public input to see what or how they should proceed. I think this survey result is an information point for them to consider and probably won't be any determiner of a scenario or specific funding levels within each of the categories, more just for something for them to consider.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Other question, Lissa? Go ahead, Lissa. You might be on mute. Looks like.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, sorry, I was double muted there. I had switched to my phone. So my concern, and obviously I kind of echo everything else that it was said, but I actually want to make sure how we're showing TAB this is not in this level of detail. More times than once, we have summarized engagement data that look, and Bethany, I think you did a great job summarizing this, but I think people will infer that it's somehow statistically significant or should have more weight than it does because the analysis is really impressive. And so I don't want TAB to like see all of the great graphics you put together. And even talking about weighting, I mean, we don't typically weight samples unless it's statistically significant data and for us to like get it to something that is statistically valid. And I don't want any of these commissioners or TAB members conflating weighting to then thinking it is an actual really solid sample. So I would really encourage Met Council staff to rethink about how you're even showing TAB this, so they don't take an incorrect conclusion and feel like it is something much more than what it is. And so maybe it's just like these key takeaways and, you know, maybe the map of showing how many were from each county. But I would really discourage you from talking about how, you know, weighting things or everything else. So I don't know if that makes sense to folks or not.
Thanks for that comment, Lissa. We did the weighting because Carver County actually had a really great turnout in proportion to their population. And then obviously there's always kind of an urban bias with the population in Hennepin and Ramsey counties overshadowing some of that need, which is why we determined to weight that when we were talking about the overall. But we did not, within the PowerPoint, there are the Thrive land uses and the county, and those are not weighted at all, so you can see a little bit more fine grain. But I think it is worth adding some caveats that this is not statistically significant. It is a small sample size, but based on those respondents, this is what we heard, and this is kind of the bare minimum input that we could gather for these scenarios at this point. But hearing some of the feedback from this round, I think we can create a more robust survey and engagement tool throughout the TPP and then through the next regional solicitation cycle.
And I might have missed one of the maps, and I apologize, but I would also be careful about talking about Hennepin County as completely urban. Were you able to break that down further? I mean, 90% of Hennepin County geography isn't population, yes, but like where people live is, or the actual like land mass is not. And once again, I appreciate, because I know like TAB made the request to try to get more public input. So just really honing this in to make sure they're not conflating this into something that it's not. Like I said, in my years in this, there's been more times than once that people stop paying attention halfway through and then all of a sudden see great data and didn't remember the caveat you gave at the beginning. So that's what I'm just trying to avoid.
Yes, and for the Hennepin County question, the Thrive land uses are based on their zip code and the midpoint. And so I think we were able to kind of separate out those very different areas within Hennepin County to more of their land use context. And so that's why we did put those land use analyses in there.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, this is Lyndon. Yeah, I would agree. The high-level summary, the tab, is the appropriate way to go. Even some of these bullet points are a little misleading to me. Anoka County, respondents allocated 30% to transit. That was 11 people, 11 respondents. In Anoka County, that's what, 500,000 population or more? That's not a statistically valid statement to make. Even you said Carver County's respondents was good. 54 out of 110,000, I wouldn't say that's good. So keep this really high level.
Good. All right. Looks like Lisa has a comment too.
Just kind of piggybacking on some of the conversation here. One of the things I will note is that when it comes to the need for additional capacity, particularly when you're talking about or Scott County anyway, it's really the trunk highways there, and it's not the local arterial, A minor arterial system as much. And they don't make that distinction. So I think when TAB hears that comment, they think that suburbs are not doing their job, and they, so sometimes, especially with the makeup of the current TAB, but it really is a state trunk highway system that fails pretty regularly in Scott County.
Okay. Anything else, Lisa?
Nope, that's all. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa. That's good context for the responses as well. Danny.
I just have a really quick question. I'm curious what number would be a good number to weight this study a little more heavily. I agree it's a pretty small sample size, and so I think the presentations to others should be pretty high level, but I am curious what number would drive us to look at this more seriously and take it a little more, for lack of a better term, take it a little more seriously, right? Like, what is that number, you think, based on our area population?
Thanks for the question, Danny. Our data scientists are on the way to potentially answer that question maybe a little more thoroughly, or we can get back to you. The survey was not in any way statistically significant. It was an opt-in, and you're also, the way we spread the information of the survey requires you to be connected to either the Met Council or metro cities or Carver or counties. And so I think that is a bias that we would see within this survey. And so in the future, we can do a lot more statistically significant analysis of the population. And I don't know what that would look like in terms of a final number, but this is certainly an opt-in bias towards those that regularly participate. And so I'm not sure what that number would be.
Okay, thanks. I was just kind of curious because I thought it was a great study, or a great survey. And it's really interesting to see how just even in this small sample size, how things line up. But I appreciate the work, and it was more of a curiosity. Thanks.
Can I jump in on that? This is sorry.
Yeah,
This is, I think, actually my fear on this is that TAB asked us to do engagement, and that is what you did. They did not ask us to do a statistically significant effort, and these are two very, very different things. And that's why, and when we do public engagement, we all know that it is not under the guise of like academic research. That is something different. And so if TAB gives the direction to do a statistically significant outreach, not an outreach effort, but a survey, that is very, very different than to do some engagement. And I think you all did engagement, and that's where we just need the appropriate caveats, and why I get nervous showing it in the like quote unquote data way you did is because people then immediately conflate it with academic research, which it is not. So that's where we have to keep going back to that this is engagement. We're not summarizing things and like, you know, from with the way the data scientist would, because this isn't actually data. This is input from 500 some residents throughout the region, which is interesting information, but it is not data.
All right.
And I know that against the TAB gives the input for statistically significant, but that is not the input they provided. They wanted some engagement, which is what you did.
Mr. Chair, we do have our data scientist online here. If you want to go to her about some of these questions.
All right. Well, I'm just going to cover it here a little bit, folks. It is 10:38. I do want to make sure we also get into the regional solicitation project rankings and funding scenarios. I think what I hear very clearly for staff is that this was really an effort to find out what some people were thinking. The product should not be related in any way as being statistically significant, that it should really just be more of an indicator of what 500 people that answered the survey were thinking. I think we've hit this with staff a couple of times. TAB has as well, that they really felt that, or at least some members of TAB felt that this was, in addition to only being what it is, was also influenced by the fact that the project list was already out, and so could be very well affected by people's desire to get particular projects funded. So if folks have anything additional to add to that, I think we just want to make sure that from a staff perspective that this is not being relayed for anything more than what we felt is really just some input and not edict to do something one way or the other. Danny, I'll call on you because your hand's still up. All right, Lissa. All right, Ashley.
Hi, my name is Ashley Asmus, and I'm a data scientist working at MTS, and I helped Bethany summarize these results. And I just wanted to put in a couple of points about the way the data were analyzed and how they might be interpreted. I agree that 500 responses from like a non-stratified sample, like we should understand sort of the universe of people who are participating in the survey, right? Like these are people who wanted to participate and wanted to give you feedback. But I do take issue with characterizing this survey as having low sample size. 500 is actually a pretty good sample size for a survey like this. And I think it's worth like thinking about these results as a representation of what the most like vocal and concerned citizens in the region are thinking about in regards to how we should distribute our funding. And I'm a little confused by the use of the word statistically significant in this conversation. I think, you know, the differences that we're seeing across Thrive categories and across counties, like I don't even think you really need to do statistics on them to know that there are large differences across our region in how people want to see funding allocated, and that it would be good to keep those trends in mind when we're allocating funding and like thinking about these discussions at a regional level. If this was like a controlled sample, where we had like mailed invitations similar to what we do for the transit onboard survey or the household survey, 500 samples would be an awesome response for a survey like this. So yeah, I just want to give props to this survey where props are due, and encourage people to take the results of the survey as seriously as they deserve. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Ashley.
And Ashley, I don't want people to think that this is an attack by any means on the work. I just want to make that really clear. And everything you just said actually makes total sense. And this is, I don't have 100% faith that all the TAB members are going to understand that is where my fear comes in. And they're going to confuse all of this with things that it is not. And so if we can just really tailor the message, then I think that will help ease my concern.
All right, folks. I think we have gone through that one quite a bit. I'm going to move on here to the next item for information, which is the regional solicitation project rankings and funding scenario, so that we can get some good discussion on that here yet today. And I'll turn that over to Steve.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know if people have time to stay a little after 11 or not, but I'll try and get through it around that amount of time here, 20 minutes or so. But so we did also invite the F&P members today, because you may remember at the last funding and programming meeting, we went through the scoring appeals. So at that point, it wasn't appropriate to bring the funding scenarios, because in fact, we did have the rankings change on 3 of the appeals that were approved by that committee. So it did change some of the funding and ranking. So this is the first time that they were able to see that as well. So we did invite F&P members to take part here in the conversation. So next slide, please. We have long story short, we have a lot more money this time available than we did last time. You may remember the application said $180 million would be available before overprogramming. If you add in all the increases from IIJA over the time period, plus the new and some of the new programs that are come about, we have upwards of $350 million available. That would include 9% overprogramming. So that money, that would include overprogramming. There's 2 new programs that we did not include in the modal funding ranges. That is what we're calling on-system bridges and the carbon reduction program. But all the STP and CMAQ money, including the TAP money, Transportation Alternatives Program, all that is included in the modal funding ranges that you can see on the left side of your screen. So that amounts to about $300 million. Next slide. So if we break that $300 million down a little bit more, just to give, we've had some questions on how much of it is new money in earlier years and how much of it is 2026 and 2027, which are the 2 primary years of the regional solicitation this cycle. So about 40 million is earlier year money. We do have a lot of projects that said they would take that earlier year money, so I think we're going to be in good shape there. Then there's a few things that come off the top. One of them is the next cycle of unique projects, and we have a slide on that later. And then we did add back in about 9% overprogramming. Usually we were doing about 10 or 11% overprogramming. We dialed that back a little bit here, and that's kind of another decision point here for TAB with input from the committees as to what that right amount is. Next slide. So today in the packet, we've put together 2 scenarios for you. One of those is the midpoint scenario. Again, that uses the midpoint of the modal funding ranges, 55.5% for roadways, 30% for transit, and 14.5% for bike ped. And then within each of those categories, allocates the money based on the number of applications submitted. And so it looks at trying to get about the same level down each of those categories. Safe routes to school, pedestrian, and multi-use trails would be in the bike ped category. So based on the number of applications that we received as one indicator of demand for projects. The second category we put together is called we're calling the bike pedestrian heavy. We put this together based on two factors. One was the high number of applications. Just in multi-use trail, we had 49 applications. But then also based in part upon the public input we received that wanted more bike ped funding. So we thought that would be a good counter second scenario to bring to this group here. To shift what amounts to about $16 million more to bike ped to get to that top of that modal funding range, which is 20%, and then takes the money proportionally out of roadways and transit. We also, and then the carbon reduction at this point is not included with that money. So we'll be asking this committee and then future ones, are there other ones that council staff should put together for consideration from the committees? Next slide, please. Here's a chart showing again the $294 million, how that would split up in both the midpoint scenario and then the bike ped heavy scenario. And we talked about what that amounted to from shifting to the top of the bike ped heavy range, which is 20%, and taking it proportionally out of roadways and transit. Next slide. Two new programs. Again, we talked about one is the on-system bridges. That's about $4 to $5 million per year. On-system means on the federal aid system, so it's not limited to just the A minor arterials and non-freeway principal arterials. That could be any functional classification. I think if this funding does continue in the future, we would want to have a discussion about if we open up the functional classes to a wider range, starting here really in December when we start thinking about the next solicitation cycle, because this is for on-system bridges, which can go down to the major collector level. But we do have that on-system bridge funding shown in the funding scenarios. It's the same in both areas, and we took that out of the modal funding ranges because we'd have dedicated bridge money. Next slide. New program number 2, carbon reduction program. Some of this money goes to the state, and then the rest of it is allocated to urban areas throughout the state. So for the Met Council area, the MPO, we do get just over $8 million per year. And you can see that I looked up some of the eligibility and the purpose of that funding to reduce CO2 emissions from on-road highway sources. We do have project types in the regional solicitation that could accept that money. It's very similar to CMAQ eligibility. So you could put that towards transit, bike ped, TDM, but there is also other project types that you could put it towards, such as EV type projects, other approaches that lower construction emissions, et cetera. And so MnDOT is having work groups starting this fall to further think about that study, and each state has to put together a carbon reduction strategy by the end of 2023, so 2 years after IIJA was signed into law. Do not have any of that money shown in the funding scenario. So that $41 million is still off to the side for discussion. I think what this committee over the next few months and TAB will have to think about is how much do we want to wait for either the state's plan or other planning work that the council is doing in this area to think about, and then develop a new process for selection of projects. And do we do that for all of the years? Again, the money's starting in 2023, so there is some urgency with the earlier years money to consider, should we use some number of years in the solicitation or use some other kind of accounting to use that money and turn it into free money in a later year. Next slide, please. Unique projects, again, the TAB set aside $4.5 million last cycle for 24 and 25. A group of council and TAB members is scoring those projects. They've had their first meeting. They've got the second one scheduled. But in short order, we have about as much money available as money we set aside. So we got 3 project requests for $3.8 million. What that scoring committee is going to have to recommend back to TAB is, do they want to fund all 3 of those projects, or do they want to reallocate some amount of that funding back to other capital projects within the regional solicitation? Question for this group in TAB would be, how much, if any, do you want to set aside for next cycle? Before we did it based on 2.5% of the money available. That was $4.5 million. Now that would amount to $6 million. So do you want to follow that same formula, or keep it at the $4.5 million for the set aside, or something else? Again, an open question. Next slide. This is something we talked about nearly 2 years ago at TAC, but I want to bring it back up to you. In the last solicitation cycle, we did partially fund 2 projects. One was in Carver County, one was in Scott County. The TAC committee in our meeting notes, we did have a note in there that said, bring this topic back up if more money comes available. So we are doing that now, since we do have money available in earlier years. I didn't really have time to hash through this very much at the funding and programming level, to tell you the truth. At this point, we did not go back and fully fund those 2 project requests, but did want to at least put that issue on the table over the next couple months, whether we should use some of this new money to fully fund those requests, or we should move on and continue funding future projects. Next slide. As you can see, we've got a lot of open questions. That's why we tried to simplify it as much as we could here, with only doing 2 funding scenarios. Another one is, we have all this new money. Again, we went from 180 million to 350 million plus. One of the rules that we had in there before was, you cannot fund more than $7 million for non-ABRT bus rapid transit projects in the 2 competitive categories. That would be transit expansion and transit modernization. So now we've got all this new money. I think our thought is that we should be flexible on that rule, in part because the spirit of the rule is really, we don't want all the money to go to BRT projects and not have other normal bus service or modernization projects kind of be left with $0 if the BRT type projects take them all. So I think we've achieved that as we will look at the actual funding, and essentially we're left with a problem of we need to have some level of flexibility on that rule, because we have more money than projects available at the end of the transit list. So we'll show you that in person in a second here. But at this point, we have not allocated all the transit money. So I think that's, if you add it all up, you'd say, oh yeah, we're a little short on transit. Well, that's because we want to have a discussion on some of these rules. Next slide. Here's the process moving forward. So really, we've got 3 months here, and at the November meeting, we're going to ask you to make a recommendation or an action item on this. Next slide. I think that's it. Maybe we'll quickly kind of go through a few things on the spreadsheet, Joe, and then we'll open it up for questions here, just before people trail off here. Now, if you can go back and open up the PDF of the spreadsheet. If not, I can do it. Oh, here he goes. Perfect. Just make that full screen if you could. All right, thanks. So we'll go through these in the next few minutes, and want to give people time for questions, and we can do this at funding and programming here in 2 weeks too, if people have specific questions. So you'll see 2 different scenarios, and those are shown, blue being the midpoint, orange being the bike ped heavy, similar to what we've done in past cycles. We did denote a few things in the tables. One, where the safety high score was. So you'll see this first in traffic management technologies, the first 4 projects that were submitted. You can see which project scored the highest for safety. We've had having all these safety discussions with our tab. We've also denoted projects that have been resubmitted. That was something that tab asked for last cycle or the cycle before, to see if there's a projects that have been submitted 2, 3, 4 times that are kind of on the bubble. Maybe that's a consideration we should give to funding. And lastly, equity bonus projects. This is something we did last year too, and this is something we keep in mind with the last few projects. If we can kind of hit as many of those equity bonus projects from the scoring process as we can, that's something we like to think, at least consider when we do these. So again, we'll go through this briefly. This is the first page is roadways. So this was one of the scoring appeals that did flip projects number 2 and 3 on the list. We're showing 5 of the 10 projects being funded. Moving down. Strategic capacity was another area where an appeal was did change the ranked order. So the Carver County project in 5th place moved from 7th to 5th. So we've got 2 different options here. In the midpoint, we're showing funding 6 of the 11 projects. In the bike ped scenario, we're funding 4 of the 11. And right around that 4 to 6 range is probably the right for the number of projects that were submitted. The Coon Rapids project did get jumped in the appeals by 1 point. It is an equity bonus project and a resubmittal. So we thought a good kind of conversation or a good dichotomy would be to show both those projects together. So 6 projects in the midpoint scenario and 4 projects in the bike ped scenario, 10 million apiece. But we thought, given that the score was so close and the appeals kind of flipped those 2 projects, the midpoint could show 6 out of 11 being funded. Yes. Further down, we've got the partially funded projects. Again, we haven't shown fully funding those at this time, but open for discussion. Further down. The highest number of projects submitted were in roadway reconstruction, at least in the highways. And you'll see that we funded a lot of those projects based on that high number that were submitted. In the midpoint scenario, we're showing funding 16 projects out of 31, and in bike ped scenario, we're funding 1 more, so 17 projects out of 31. One thing to note here in the we have footnoted it at F&P. At the next F&P meeting, we'll have an info item on the HSIP projects, but there was number 16 was a City of Shakopee project, also submitted an HSIP submittal for $2 million. That will be above that funding line, so we'll get $2 million. They submitted the same exact project here. So we thought that giving it $1.7 million to fully fund its request between HSIP and here for the same exact project made some level of sense. So instead of funding it kind of completely in 1 or 2 programs, we'll give it the full $3.7 million request, roughly half in HSIP, half here. Okay, scrolling down. Here's that bridge funding. Again, we did, because there was dedicated bridge money, we pulled this money out of the modal funding ranges and funded it with that on-system bridges. We're showing funding 4 out of the 5 bridges here at this point. Okay, moving on. Next page is the transit and TDM categories. Again, the midpoint is 30% of the total funding. We are showing either 5 of the 7 or 6 of the 7 projects in transit expansion as being funded. The check marks kind of jump off this page here a little bit, but that is showing the BRT rule we talked about, that $7 million BRT rule, and the new market guarantee. So we got plenty of new market projects. So we fulfilled that rule. The BRT one, again, we think we should have some flexibility in there, because as you scroll down to transit modernization, again, we have 2 projects left. They're both BRT projects, but we have used up the $7 million of BRT projects up above in the number 2 project in transit expansion. That would be the Washington County Park and Ride for $7 million. So again, we think there should be some flexibility there because we have more money than projects available. And we have funded plenty of non-BRT projects. So the 2 BRT projects that, again, we'll be talking about will be the 2 red line projects, number 5 and number 6 in transit modernization. Further down, now we get in, $25 million for the arterial BRT. So that's something that was in the application. That would go to the G line. Tab will have a presentation, I believe, next month on G line and future and other future lines for Metro Transit. The TMO TDM set aside traditionally has been about, we've set aside $5.8 million. You'll see a $3 million in there, and that's because the TMOs did not use all of the money during COVID for TDM activities. It wasn't needed. So we think we can fund that at a lower level, $3 million this time. They can still do everything they want to do. But again, they didn't use all the money due to COVID and lack of travel and there. So we do gain back some money there that usually is set aside for TMOs. Lastly, on this page, and we'll wrap up Transit and TDM. Again, we do set aside the $1.2 million for more near-term projects. So we did have 7 projects in the innovative TDM category funded. We're showing funding 5 of those 7 projects. Again, with some money that was turned back, we can go beyond the 1.2 million and actually get closer to $2 million of funding there. Last page, and I'll turn it back for questions. This is the bicycle and pedestrian category, 3 categories. The midpoint is 14.5% of the total money available. 2 funding scenarios, and you can see they're quite different because this is where we're putting the money in the bike ped heavy scenario, the 16 million. 49 applications submitted in multi-use trails, and we are getting to, in the midpoint scenario, only to project number 10 out of 49. And part of that reason why is because many of the top scoring projects are asking for $5.5 million or thereabouts. So you go through a lot of money quickly, and that prevents you from going further down that list. And we don't need to kind of relitigate kind of the $3.5 million to $5.5 million max that we've talked about kind of over the years. But in this case, it does prevent you from going further down that list. In the bike ped heavy scenario, we get to the project number 13, and based on the methodology we used to allocate the money based on the project submitted, we probably would have funded further down that list, but you really hit a log jam at projects number 14, two projects tied for 14 and 2 projects tied for 16. And they're all asking for between $4 million and $5.5 million. So without kind of splitting up those ties, it's kind of tough to get over that hump without some more money, which we do have some more money that we haven't allocated. That's one option to do that. Joe, a little further down the list, now to ped and safe routes to school. So in the midpoint, we're funding 2 projects out of 10 in both pedestrian and safe routes to school. And because in the bike ped scenario, we couldn't really get over that wall at project number 14, that money is shown as going further down both the pedestrian and safe routes to school, shown in orange there. So we're left, we've used essentially all of that money. So if you look at the yet to program, the last row down there on each of these modal funding categories, you'll see how much over programming or money we didn't allocate to actual projects. But this is showing 9% over programming. And transit's really the area where we need to allocate more of that money. So I think with that, Mr. Chair, let me turn it back to you. I'd try to go as quick as I could here and give people an indication of how we put together these funding scenarios.
Yeah, no, appreciate that, Steve, and I appreciate folks hanging on as it is 7 minutes after 11 already here. Couple things just that kind of come to mind, Steve, are understand that carbon money starts in 23 and moves on. And I know you asked applicants for when they could deliver projects. how is that moving into this process? And then 2, understanding some detail from various states and internally at MnDOT, the process to which the effectively, we'll call it a grants, but the process for the carbon is really open and out there, but the processes haven't caught up yet with how to shall I say, activate that money for various partners other than those that already have an established process. I'm wondering, do we start to look at bringing this scenario for the carbon into kind of the regular bike ped TDM process, where maybe the midpoint is a scenario, but the other is looking at, well, how much could carbon fund? And maybe it's not all in 23, right? I mean, but we have funds from 23, 24 on out. And how could that fit within this? And then considering that's what, 40 million, 41 million. And even on the high end of our bike ped scenario, we were only at about 16.2 million, I think. Could you then pull some of that back into other projects, which I'm going to say is probably going to be roadways, since you said we don't have enough transit projects. Is that another scenario that could be looked at? And maybe, again, because of the carbon funds kind of coming with some of their own difficulties, but if we don't pick 23 projects, you're not going to have money for 23. Or if we don't identify those, they're not going to have time to deliver. Yeah. So that was kind of a long way of saying, can't we start to think about bringing the carbon projects in, maybe displacing some of the funds that are being used in the bike ped heavy scenario and returning that over to a midpoint as another scenario?
Yeah, it feels like, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it almost needs a separate meeting just to talk about carbon reduction, because it's a good deal of money. We got some time constraints. We've set it outside of the modal funding ranges, so I don't think it would increase roadway funding. The eligibility is just for transit, bike, and bike ped.
Yep, just thinking if you took some of the funds that you currently are allocating to it without carbon and replaced it. So instead of 16.5 million, maybe you even if you allocated 20 million of that carbon, right? And then took that 16, could you take parts of that and put over on roadway that certainly have bike ped improvements and certain other elements?
Yep, I see what you're saying. Yep. Yeah, we did have several projects that, especially in the transit area, that could take 2023 money. Some bike ped projects, but I think that becomes difficult with the time. I mean, we're in 2023, program year from the state perspective, at least. So that it becomes easier to use it almost on a transit project, because then you can transfer the money to FTA and you got a little more flexibility. But yeah, you can see how it gets confusing quick in our thinking and trying to simplify some of these decisions here, and that almost needs probably a separate meeting here to think through it.
Okay, well, that's just something there. I know you had a couple questions you wanted us to see if we could get to. So maybe it's between the two scenarios to start out with, right? Any other feedback for another scenario? Is that one of the questions for us today?
Yeah, that's the question for here, and I guess for TAB probably. We probably look for direction on TAB to do more. We've done 10, sometimes we've done 10. It's been too many and too overwhelming. And our thought is, if these two look decent with some maybe changes at the periphery, the last couple projects, maybe it's easier to work on a smaller number of scenarios, because we do have all these other open questions. But that's up to this group and TAB too, if they want to see us put together other scenarios. I think there's a lot of money here, so we're gonna get the top projects in each category for sure. It's just a matter of what you do with those last couple projects in. And
Okay, Lisa, you got some thoughts?
Well, one, I'd be interested in maybe adding to this spreadsheet when projects thought they could take money, because that might help us see some opportunities. And then I was, and I pointed that out in the chat, you know, because I've read through the unique projects just because my commissioner was asking me to help him because he's on the scoring committee. And it seems like some of those might fit into that carbon, if they choose to fund them, would fit into that carbon funding and align with that. So that's maybe another opportunity to consider kind of how we make the progress work here. It seems to me, and that we've had this trail list that just gets longer and longer and longer over the time period, even though we've done, I think, a good job at trying to pick trails. It seems like we have a lot more trails than any other category that don't get funded. And maybe this is an opportunity to look at how we could get even more funded than perhaps you have shown here in the heavy bike ped, if we kind of work things a little differently.
Yep. Okay. Some good thoughts there, Lisa. Thanks.
Okay, Lyndon.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, another idea, I guess, maybe looks like there's over programming funded in here. I agree that the carbon money is a good opportunity to fund more of the bike ped stuff for sure. Maybe some of the transit, maybe even the traffic technologies. There's a great opportunity here to do that. Maybe if you wanted to kind of sprinkle more money somehow to the roads, you could use that over programming money for the roadway part, and then that would free up, you know, then there would be, and use the carbon money for the ped bike transit category. That would be another way maybe to get more reconstruction projects funded.
Yep. Good. Carl?
So I presume that having a ped heavy option kind of came out of the survey that people were kind of skeptical about. In the past, what have been the other viable options? I know we had a roadway one. What did we actually pick the last time? Just the midpoint?
Yeah, that's been the theme. You know, we've done transit heavy, roadway heavies, and then we've done themes with kind of bigger projects, smaller projects, more expansion versus reconstruction. And there's kind of allies on each side, or people on each side of those camps, so that the compromise has tended to be to draw back to the midpoint. We thought this bike ped was a kind of a good option that would be a good kind of secondary option that maybe in past years wouldn't have flown, but people may find some value in that this cycle going around.
Okay. Jason.
Thanks, Chair. This is Jason Piper with Hennepin County. Just a question regarding the bridge funding category. I seem to recall setting like a $10 million target as part of the solicitation, and I think that was before we knew the benefits of IIJA. So I was just curious, Steve, if you could walk us through how those funding lines were determined in comparison to the 10 million bridge funding target.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair and Jason. So I did make a bridge funding by year spreadsheet that wasn't attached here, but it's essentially this bridge money uses the on-system bridge money from 25, 26, and 27. So 3 years of that funding come into play here. And so that's roughly $13.4 million. The bridge target, we viewed it as, we hadn't decided on the number of bridges, more or less than 10 million. So we took those projects out of the modal funding range because we thought if we put the bridge money just kind of into the pot of money, then you're not accomplishing that. Then the money's going to other modes and other things. We said, well, this is bridge money for bridges. Let's put those 3 years towards bridges. Same thing with carbon reduction. That's why we kept it out of the modal funding range. So what's shown here, I guess, long story short, is 24, 20, or 25, 26, and 27 bridge money. The earlier years, 23 and 24, we would allocate to past funded bridges. Again, we don't have time to fund a 2023 bridge. So we would go back into the projects we funded with bridge money in the past and bring that bridge money and use it there to free up later year money, essentially.
Okay. Other comments on that? Otherwise, maybe we go to, I think, one of the other questions, unique projects.
Well, before we go there, Mr. Chair, I noticed on that HSIP comment there you had, Steve. Great idea in theory, but I don't think that's allowed. Is it by policy?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and Lyndon. So there is a rule you can't kind of double up on the funding. And in talking to MnDOT staff, we thought this was a kind of a fair way to do it, because it wasn't like you were putting 10 million towards an interchange and then getting 2 million in HSIP. In the end here, we're only fully funding their request versus kind of adding on to the maximum on a big project. And so in talking to MnDOT, they thought this would be a kind of a fair approach to doing that, because you weren't kind of doubling up on the full request.
Steve, what about, since you don't have over programming in yet, and it does seem like that's,
yeah,
it maybe opens up another question for us in the process. Could that be taken care of through over programming to fully fund that and then drop one of the applications?
You could do that, and then you'd fund one more project on the HSIP list, probably. We do include the 9% over programming into what's shown here.
Okay.
The last row is yet the program. I'm looking really closely at what Joe has. We've got about $1 million in the midpoint. Can you zoom in on that, Joe, a little bit?
And that's based on the 9% versus 10?
9% over programming. So if you add another percent, that gets you another $2 million. About.
Not sure where you want me on the sheet.
Yeah. yet the program. So we've allocated 9% over programming, except for $1 million. Bike pads heavy scenario, we've allocated 9% over programming, except for $3.5 million. That gets to a little bit to the lumpiness of the projects coming in at 7 or 10 million a pop.
Not sure.
Okay. All right, Nathan, you got a comment?
Thanks, Chair. Steve, really appreciate all the work you're doing. I know it's not easy. One question I did have is I can't tell if there's uncertainty of the timing of when the carbon reduction program money may or may not come, or how it could or could not be in this solicitation. I think there's a lot of more questions than answers at this point. So I think just optically, it does look a little tough when you do the scenarios, especially given the focus on safety, potentially from TAB's perspective, that when you look at like the PED and safe routes category, that in one of the scenarios, not many get funded. And when you look at the distribution geographically of projects, and that typically, I think Lisa may have brought this up, but this is one of the few areas that many applicants from across the MPO can get additional funding for, trails and walking and biking. And I think that could be really challenging conversation when putting together these scenarios. So part of a little bit of commentary, but also if there's any other certainty of when we'd be able to figure out this carbon reduction program money of how we start piecing this together, because I think that's still a big unknown for me of how that piece of the puzzle comes together. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and Nathan. as we understand it from Brian Gage at MnDOT Central Office, it is starting in 2023. The money is available at that $8 million mark. It's just some of our planning work hasn't caught up to it, maybe all the work groups and other things, but the money is available. So he has asked us to start thinking about it.
Hey, is your tummy still hungry?
Yeah, and Steve, maybe to that point, right? The carbon plan is not in place. And so, right, ideally you would have your plan in place and then you would allocate money to projects. In lieu of that, Federal Highway Administration does allow you to program projects as long as they're in the general I guess parameters of the formula funds. And so I think that's Brian's point is you're running out of time for 23, and maybe it's a meeting again between MnDOT and Met Council on how much we could lean forward in this. But I think in lieu of the fact that the plan isn't going to be done until late 23, we miss out on a year of funding that otherwise is probably could be transferred to a whole different program altogether.
You're all done with this, Loretta?
All right. Any more comments on that particular subject? Oh, am I hearing Lissa? Nope, that's not Lissa. That's the 4-year-old,
Well,
I think.
It was me, but she unmuted me and I didn't realize it.
Did you have anything else to add on this, Lissa?
No, nor does my daughter.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know. But she's getting into the policy stuff early. Good. Any other questions on this? Otherwise, maybe if we could quickly transition quickly to that next question on unique projects. I guess my 2 cents is here we got 3 projects just using the 4 million. I don't know that they're particularly strong, but I don't know if we could, I guess in my point is maybe we hold the funding cap at 4 million, but there could be, it just seems like an odd way to do it is to carve out the 2 million instead of, or the 4 million, without having a good sense of what projects are that want to come that way. If the region wanted to go more towards, and I think we heard some questions and some direction coming out of the electric plan, the electric vehicle plan, maybe that's something that could be more targeted as an option, but otherwise I'd say stay with the 4, but I'm sure others have other ideas. Cole?
Yeah, I was just going to note, relative to Lyndon's comment earlier about resiliency, that was actually a project area that TAB talked about when they created the unique projects. We were a bit surprised we didn't get any submittals, though we did get some questions from Hennepin County, I think, about a water treatment or, runoff surface water treatment area. So just that idea that maybe it just takes another round to get people interested in that.
Right.
I think there is a lot of potential for projects in that category based on what TAB was saying they wanted to see.
Anybody else on that? Thank you for that, Cole. Maybe not strong feelings on it one way or the other at this point till folks become more aware of what some of those unique projects are, Steve.
Yeah.
And I am going to float out there then the, I guess I'll call it suspension of the maximum of 7 million for bus rapid transit rule.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts on that, since there is more money available for transit than currently we have for projects?
I think that sounds reasonable.
Okay. Thanks, Carl. I agree. I think, it wasn't intended to prohibit it when money is directed towards transit. So that should be opened up. All right. Did I get your question, Steve? I'm trying to keep folks under a half hour, keep it over. So
just a final comment, Mr. Chair. So I think, we got the bridge money shown in there as as part of our scenarios, right? We're allocating the money. I do think it's important to show a carbon use scenario the next time we show this to people. So thank you. Thanks for all your work.
Yeah. Thank you, Lyndon. That's good. That's a good comment. Innocent.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I was also surprised with the quality of the number of projects that were submitted for unique projects. I know we're dealing with a climate change and a lot of strategies to reduce the greenhouse gases in the region, since we are not able to meet the goals that we set up in 2007. So it just depends on maybe more education or the awareness of people. I'm sure there should be a lot of stronger projects that can be submitted either under the carbon reduction program or the unique projects categories. There should be more, but I was surprised with the number that were submitted.
Yeah. Yeah, and thank you for being on that technical committee, Innocent, looking at those projects. And looks like Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a clarification on the transit fund. So I see total available funding now, 363 million. Yeah, it makes sense to me to allow the some flexibility on the BRT rule, but I guess my question is that assuming under both scenarios or just the midpoint scenario? I guess I'm a little unclear as to if the 363 will cover all projects under both scenarios. I don't know, Steve, if you can speak to that.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair and Matt. Good question. So we have it would be for both scenarios. So we have about $11 million available under either of those scenarios. You don't get all the way down the list for sure on the bike ped heavy one because you have 4 projects left. You have 3 projects left in the blue in the midpoint, and you don't quite fund all 3 of those. But you do fund 2 of the 3 in the midpoint for sure, and almost 3, I guess, with the projects amount to what, 12 or 13 million left in the blue scenario, midpoint scenario. So that, then I think we're gonna have to ask the committees if they're okay, if you're okay with being flexible on that rule, do you want to go down all the way on both of these lists or not? I think that's a fair question that we've asked for, like traffic management technology, some of these other categories. Sometimes we get down to the bottoms of the list, and then people say, well, do we want to fund them all? Do we not? And so I think that would be the next question: is do we want to go to the bottom of each of those 2 lists?
So there will be further discussion with the committees on this topic, is what I'm hearing.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That helps. Thank you.
Okay. Other comments on this? Steve, did we get to the basic questions today to give you some general feedback?
Yeah, I think we did. So I think we got some good feedback on that, flexing the rule, looking at unique projects a little closer for what potential funding sources could be used, how to think about carbon reduction, and a general sense that especially that trail list keeps growing year after cycle. So are there ways we can kind of strategize to get further down that list?
Okay.
Chair, this is Nathan. I have one more question. Steve, can you talk about how this is going to be presented to TAB?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, Nathan. In a more simplified manner, we, just like the surveys that Bethany brought you, we try and give the technical groups kind of more background, more details. But I think having a couple key questions like we did here, but that we want their input on, I think is maybe the most important, because I think my impression is they're going to have trouble understanding, well, if we do something similar to what we did today, they're going to have difficulty taking in all that information, especially the newer TAB members. I'm guessing that's what you're hinting at here, right?
Yeah, Chair. Thanks, Steve. That's kind of what I was wondering, given the previous conversation. And then the last question I have, I know it's getting late, is no, we didn't talk about the one scenario of funding older projects. And dating back to previous tabs from 2018, there had been conversations of not going back and funding old projects. So I'm just curious if staff is going to bring up that history of previous tabs have made clear that we would not go back and fund short or partially funded projects that had been submitted, like that had been a decision that had been made in previous cycles, because otherwise it should probably open up the conversation for all projects that could take more funding, which then gets into a very complex story. So that was my last comment, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think well, more time at funding and programming, hopefully this month too.
Yeah, that feels like there's a little bit more discussion on that, on the nuances, Steve. So, all right, it is 11:32 by my clock. Steve, appreciate this, but I think there's going to be much more discussion on this again. I do want to let folks go. If you have a minute, it's really about schedule and what I talked about at the beginning. We'll continue virtual meetings. I am considering that the November meeting be in person as we move forward. That schedule starts to look like what it starts to look like. And the November meeting of TAC is really those the project selection recommendations. And I think it would be beneficial to have everybody in person. Might aid in the discussion as well on those scenarios. So that is not fully vetted. One of the things we did talk about is that we would need to make sure TAC members are fully informed that schedules would be updated with a additional kind of meeting notice for travel, so folks don't forget about that. Some things like that. So more to come on that, but keep that in the back of your mind that November TAC could be in person. So, and with that, I think that concludes our business for today. If agencies have any updates, please send them to Joe, and then we'll send them out via email rather than taking time today. And with that, we'll adjourn our September 7th TAC meeting. Thanks all.
Thank you. People do have other questions on the solicitation, they can reach out to me directly too.
Thank you for that, Steve.